Actually, it's interesting. Sounds rather sort of bizarre, but I did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it.
The innocence about her, you just thought, wow, this girl is knockout.
For years, the story of Princess Diana's tragic death has been told from the perspective of the royal family, the media, and the public. But now, Princess Diana's brother, Spencer, is revealing hidden details, moments that were never discussed, and truths that challenge everything people thought they knew. Why was the funeral procession so painful for Diana's sons, William and Harry? What happened behind closed doors when the royal family first learned of her death? Join us as we uncover the heartbreaking reality of what Diana's brother has revealed. Funeral procession of Princess Diana. The world stood still, 1997. Millions of people lined the streets of London, while over 2.5 billion more watched from their television screens across the globe. The funeral of Princess Diana was a moment of collective mourning, a day never to be forgotten in British history. But among all the sorrowful images of that day, one stood out more than any other. Two young boys, Prince William and Prince Harry, walking behind their mother's coffin. The sight was heartbreaking. William, only 15, and Harry, just 12, marched with quiet, somber faces as the crowd wept around them. On September 6th, the weight of grief, duty, and expectation all pressed down on them as they took each step. It was an image that would define their childhood, haunting Harry for decades. And what most people didn't know then was that this was never their choice. The person who fought against it the hardest, their uncle, Charles Spencer. What you are about to witness is heartbreaking, so keep watching to discover why. Charles Spencer is Diana's younger brother, the man who had grown up alongside her, the one person who understood the pain she had endured within the royal family. When the burial committee informed him that Diana's sons would walk in the procession, his reaction was instant and firm. Never. According to Spencer, he had been speaking with a Buckingham Palace courtier, discussing the arrangements for the funeral when the plan was casually mentioned to him. The idea alone stunned him. The thought of two young boys, fresh in their grief, being paraded in front of the world seemed unthinkable to him. He refused outright. She would never have wanted them to do this, Spencer recalled saying. But his protests were met with cold resistance. The response from the palace was direct. It has been decided. But Spencer didn't back down easily. He pushed, argued, and demanded that the plan be reconsidered. He pointed out that it was cruel, unnecessary, and profoundly unnatural to make children walk behind their mother's coffin, with cameras zooming in on their every expression. But his words fell on deaf ears. And then came the lie. At some point in the discussion, Spencer was told that William and Harry wanted to do it. That changed everything for him. If this were their decision, then he would not interfere. He wouldn't force them into something they didn't want. So reluctantly, he let the matter go. But the truth finally came out after many years. Prince Harry admitted that they had never indeed been given a choice. They had simply been told what to do. As a 12-year-old, Harry had no power to refuse. He followed orders. Spencer, who had believed he was honoring their wishes, later realized he had been misled. He had unknowingly stepped aside for something he would never have allowed had he known the truth. The morning of the funeral was heavy with sorrow. The streets were lined with grieving faces, people holding flowers, handwritten notes, and photographs of the princess they had loved so much. The air felt different, thick with grief, shock, and disbelief. And then they appeared. Charles Spencer walked beside Prince Charles, Prince Philip, and the two boys. The cameras zoomed in on William and Harry. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were cast downward. Every step they took was scrutinized, every movement analyzed. The world saw them as brave, as dignified. But Spencer saw something else. He saw two children burdened with a duty they should never have been given. The walk from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey was long and painful. The sound of sobbing thundered from the crowd, but the boys never broke. They held themselves together, never letting a single tear fall in public. Harry later described it as numb, as if his emotions had utterly shut down. The entire event felt strange to him, like something happening to someone else. For Spencer, the pain of that day wasn't just about losing his sister. It was about witnessing what he saw as an injustice. He had lost the battle to protect his nephews from this moment, and he knew there was nothing he could do now except walk beside them. But what Spencer did next left everyone speechless. Spencer's speech and the beginning. As the world watched, Spencer took the podium inside Westminster Abbey to deliver his eulogy. No one knew exactly what he would say. What followed was one of the most potent, direct speeches ever at a royal funeral. He didn't speak about Diana, he spoke for her. Spencer described his sister as the most hunted person of the modern age. He blamed the media and the institutions that had failed to protect her. The royal family listened as he spoke words that cut deep. The Queen remained emotionless. Prince Charles showed no reaction, but the rest of the world heard exactly what Spencer was saying. Then came the moment that made headlines around the world. Spencer promised that Diana's blood family, not the Windsors, would always protect and guide William and Harry. It directly challenged the royal family's authority, a declaration that Diana's sons would not be left entirely in their hands. The response was something rarely seen at a royal event: applause. The crowd inside the Abbey, which included dignitaries, celebrities, and political figures, broke into spontaneous clapping. It was unheard of at a funeral. But at that moment, Spencer spoke about what many felt. Diana had been wronged, and someone was finally saying it out loud. Sadly, things would not go the way Spencer had planned. As powerful as his words were, Spencer would later admit that keeping that promise was impossible. William and Harry were already deeply embedded in the royal system. There was no way he could remove them from it or personally raise them as Diana might have wished. The monarchy controlled their future, and he could do nothing about it. But that is not all. This is just the beginning of the story. Years later, Prince Harry would speak openly about how deeply that funeral affected him. He admitted that, in today's world, such a thing would never be allowed to happen to grieving children. Times had changed largely because of Diana's influence, but no one had fought hard enough to stop it back then. For Charles Spencer, the funeral procession remained one of the most painful moments of his life. He has never softened his stance or changed his view that what happened to William and Harry that day was wrong. For the boys themselves, it was an unforgettable moment that would eventually lead Harry to question everything about the institution he was born into. But the funeral itself was just the public goodbye. The days leading up to it were filled with confusion, silence, and frustration. The world mourned, but the royal family remained quiet. Their response, or lack thereof, only added to the anger. And that's where we turn next. The moment Charles Spencer first received the devastating phone call, how the royal family reacted behind closed doors, and the chaos that unfolded in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death. Let's return to the early hours of August 31st, 1997, when the world changed forever. In a tunnel in Paris, a black Mercedes carrying Princess Diana crashed while trying to outrun paparazzi. The impact was brutal. The car crumpled like a tin can. Inside, Diana was still alive, but barely. The news spread fast, first as whispers, then as breaking headlines. The world didn't know it yet, but within hours, the most famous woman on the planet would be gone. And when the confirmation finally came, Diana, Princess of Wales, was dead. But behind the scenes, a different kind of chaos was unfolding before the public even knew what had happened. Miles away in South Africa, Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, was asleep when the phone rang. It was a call he would never forget. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. Diana had been in a car accident in Paris. She was severely injured. No further details. Spencer sat up in bed, his mind racing. An accident? He knew how the press hounded her, how they chased her relentlessly. Had they pushed her too far this time? He waited, heart pounding for more news. Minutes turned into an hour. Then came the second call. This time, the voice was different, colder. "I'm sorry, sir. She didn't make it." He knew exactly who to blame. The paparazzi. The same photographers who had hounded her for years had been chasing her car that night. But there was no time to grieve. The world was about to discover, and nothing would ever be the same. The reaction of the royal family will leave you completely speechless. Initial reaction of the royal family. When news of Diana's death hit the airwaves, the reaction was immediate.
Diana, Princess of Wales, has in fact been killed.
People poured into the streets in tears. Grown men, women, and children sobbed openly, their faces buried in their hands. Outside Buckingham Palace, outside Kensington Palace, everywhere Diana had ever touched, flowers piled up by the thousands. It wasn't just mourning, it was heartbreak. But something strange was happening at the top. The royal family was silent through it all. For hours, then days, there was no public statement, no national address. There was no sign that they were mourning with the people. Instead, they remained at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, hidden from view. At first, people assumed they were in shock, but as time passed, the silence felt like something else. It was indifference. Why wasn't the Queen saying anything? Why wasn't the flag at Buckingham Palace lowered to half-mast? Why weren't Charles and the boys in London? The anger started to rise. The newspapers, usually respectful of the monarchy, turned against them.
On September 6, 1997, a 9-year-old boy's uncle stood in front of 2,000 mourners inside Westminster Abbey and did something no member of the British aristocracy had dared to do in living memory. He accused the institution sitting 3 feet in front of him of failing to protect his sister. That man was Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, and the words he chose that morning would echo for decades, resurfacing in interviews, documentaries, and a royal family that has never fully recovered from what he said. This is the story of what Charles Spencer actually witnessed behind the scenes of Diana's death, why he broke with royal protocol to say it out loud, and why, nearly 3 decades later, he still refuses to take any of it back. To understand why Spencer's words carried so much weight, it helps to understand who he was to Diana. He wasn't a courtier or a royal in-law offering a polite tribute. He was her younger brother. The two of them raised together at Park House on the Sandringham estate, close enough in age and temperament that Diana often described him as one of the only people who understood what she was up against once she married into the royal family. Biographer Andrew Morton, who worked directly with Diana on his 1992 book Diana, Her True Story, in her own words, documented how isolated she felt inside the monarchy almost from the beginning, a portrait that Spencer would later echo publicly, in his own words, using his own platform. Morton's book was itself a landmark moment in how the public came to understand Diana's inner life, because it revealed, through interviews conducted secretly and only confirmed as hers years later, that Diana had struggled with loneliness, with the pressures of public scrutiny, and with a marriage that had unraveled largely out of public view before the divorce made it official in 1996. That context matters because it shaped how Spencer and much of the British public would come to interpret everything that followed her death, not as an isolated tragedy involving a single car crash in Paris, but as the final chapter of a much longer story about a woman who had spent years trying to be seen and protected by an institution that, in Spencer's own repeated telling, never fully extended either to her. The events leading up to that funeral began in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, when a car carrying Diana crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris while being pursued by photographers on motorcycles. Diana was 36 years old. Within hours, the news reached every corner of the globe, and the public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace within the day, laying flowers by the thousands, many of them weeping openly in the street for a woman most of them had never met, but felt they somehow knew. What the public didn't see, at least not right away, was the royal family's response, or rather, the apparent absence of one. In the days following Diana's death, the royal family remained at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, out of public view, while William and Harry, then 15 and 12, were kept largely shielded from the cameras. The royal family's continued silence, with no formal statement, no lowered flag at Buckingham Palace, became its own story. British newspapers, many of which had spent years supporting the monarchy without question, began openly demanding to know why the Queen had not spoken. That pressure built for 5 days, an unusually long silence for an institution built on ceremony and public reassurance, and it left a vacuum that British newspapers were quick to fill with increasingly pointed questions. Why hadn't the flag above Buckingham Palace been lowered? Why were William and Harry being kept so far from London while the rest of the country openly grieved? Why did the family that Diana had married into seem so absent at the exact moment the public needed to see some sign, any sign, that they understood the scale of what had happened? For a monarchy that had spent generations projecting quiet stability as its greatest strength, the silence read to millions as something closer to indifference, and it created a genuine crisis of public confidence that royal historians still point to as one of the most precarious moments in the modern monarchy's history. It was only on September 5, 1997, 5 days after Diana's death, that Queen Elizabeth II addressed the nation live from Buckingham Palace, describing Diana as someone she admired for her energy and her devotion to William and Harry. It was widely seen at the time, and has been analyzed since by royal historians, including Robert Lacey, as a moment the monarchy was forced into rather than one it chose freely. By the time the address aired, much of the goodwill the royal family might otherwise have received had already curdled into public frustration, and the speech, though well received in the moment, did little to fully repair the sense that the institution had been caught flat-footed by a wave of grief it never expected and didn't know how to answer. It was against this backdrop, a grieving public, a defensive institution, and 2 boys caught in the middle, that the funeral itself took shape. One of the most visually striking and emotionally difficult elements of that day was the decision to have William and Harry walk behind their mother's coffin during the procession from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey, alongside their father Prince Charles, their grandfather Prince Philip, and their uncle Charles Spencer. The image of 2 boys barely into their teenage years, walking in full public view behind a coffin carrying their mother's body, became one of the defining photographs of the 20th century, reproduced in newspapers and documentaries ever since. The decision itself was made by a joint committee involving the royal household and representatives of Diana's family, and accounts of exactly how that decision was reached have varied over the years depending on who is telling the story. What is consistent across nearly every retelling, including Spencer's own, is that the final arrangement was framed publicly as something William and Harry themselves had agreed to, a framing that allowed the plan to proceed while sparing both the family and the public the discomfort of acknowledging that 2 children were being asked to carry their grief in full view of the world. Whether the boys genuinely had a meaningful say in the matter, or whether the decision was effectively made for them and presented afterward as their own wish, remains one of the more debated details of that entire week, and it's a detail Spencer himself has revisited more than once when discussing the funeral in later interviews. Both William and Harry have spoken about that walk in the years since, and their accounts help explain why the moment still carries such weight. In the 2017 documentary Diana, Our Mother, Her Life and Legacy, produced jointly by the BBC and HBO to mark the 20th anniversary of Diana's death, both princes reflected candidly on what that day felt like from the inside. Harry described feeling a kind of emotional shutdown, saying the day felt almost as though it was happening to someone else rather than to him. William, for his part, said in the same documentary that no child should be asked to do what he and his brother did that day, walking in full view of the world while trying to process a loss they hadn't even begun to understand. Charles Spencer has spoken about his own discomfort with the arrangement in multiple interviews over the years, including in the 2017 ITV documentary Diana, 7 Days, where he discussed his experience of that week in detail. He has described feeling that the funeral planning process moved forward with a momentum he had limited ability to influence, and that watching his young nephews walk that route was one of the most difficult things he witnessed that entire week. What's notable is that Spencer's account isn't one of triumphant intervention. He has been candid that he had far less control over royal funeral arrangements than the public might assume, and that his primary role that day became walking alongside the boys rather than shielding them from the moment entirely. If the procession was the visual centerpiece of grief that day, Spencer's eulogy was its verbal reckoning. Standing at the pulpit inside Westminster Abbey, in front of the Queen, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, and dignitaries from around the world, Spencer delivered what is still regarded as one of the most direct and unscripted speeches ever given at a state funeral. He didn't simply eulogize his sister in warm, safe language. He described her as, in his words, the most hunted person of the modern age, and he directed pointed criticism at the press for the role they played in the years of pursuit that preceded her death. He went further still, making a promise that Diana's blood family, not the royal family she had married into, would help guide and protect William and Harry going forward, a line widely understood at the time as a direct challenge to the institution sitting silently in the pews in front of him. What happened next has become one of the most talked about moments in modern royal history. As Spencer finished speaking, applause began outside the Abbey among the crowds who had gathered to watch on giant screens, and remarkably, that applause spread inside the building itself, breaking with centuries of funeral protocol. It was an almost unheard of reaction inside a state funeral, and it signaled something the royal family could not ignore. The public agreed with Spencer, at least in that moment, that Diana had not been protected the way she should have been, and that someone finally had the courage to say so in front of the people who mattered. Inside the Abbey itself, the reaction from the royal family was far more restrained. The Queen's expression, by nearly every account and photograph from that day, remained composed and unreadable throughout, and neither she nor Prince Charles was seen joining in the applause that had swept through the rest of the congregation. That contrast between a stone-faced institution and an emotionally unguarded public became its own kind of commentary on everything Spencer had just said, without either side needing to add another word. But Spencer has also been honest, in later years, about the limits of what that speech actually accomplished. Keeping the promise he made that day, that Diana's blood family would meaningfully shape how William and Harry were raised, proved far more complicated in practice than it sounded from the pulpit. William and Harry remained within the royal household and the institutional structures that come with it,